Chapter 3 of Tractate Kesubos continues discussing various laws of marriage. The first Mishnah says, if a Na'ara, a girl in a middle stage of adulthood, is illegitimate, or a Gibeonite, or a Kuthian, and is violated, God forbid, she's paid a fine. If a convert, captive, or slave girl who were ransomed, converted, or emancipated as a child were violated, they're also paid a fine. If somebody violates his own relative, his sister, aunt, sister-in-law, father's brother's wife, or a nida, a menstruating woman, they're paid a fine. This is although the violator is also subject to the punishment of kares. The Gemara further clarifies these points. It also discusses the verses which source these laws, and it qualifies which opinions on these laws these statements seem to reject. There's also some additional points on the different forms of capital punishment that used to be administered when there was a Sanhedrin. There are related points discussed, and this is all qualified further. It also mentions other forms of reimbursement for such crimes. There's an apparent contradiction. Our Mishnah says a person who violates his sister is liable to pay a fine, while a later source says he's liable for lashes. The difference between these cases is disputed. The other one could be where he was warned beforehand, possibly, but this is discussed and it cites some sources. It quotes additional verses as sources for several of these laws and similar, such as for financial reimbursement after injuring somebody, and these sources are further qualified. It also discusses the various punishments for the violation of various other prohibitions. It's on things like particular violations of the Shabbos and similar. Further, some would hold by that later source that the punishment for somebody violating their sister is both lashes and a fine. And this is further debated as to why some hold like this and others disagree. There's further discussion on this and some similar related points. It cites further rulings on these fines by additional particular unique cases, and these are all discussed further. New Mishnah, the Na'aras who aren't entitled to a fine are as follows: a convert, captive, or a slave girl who were ransomed, converted, or emancipated after they were a child. Some say a captive who was ransomed is presumed to not have been violated, even if they're older than a child. Also, there's no fine if the violator is liable for the death penalty, such as someone who's with their daughter or granddaughter or stepdaughter. The Gemara discusses related opinions. It further debates, based off sources, if captives are suspected of having been cohabited with. It also discusses the very source for the point that somebody who was liable for capital punishment does not have to pay fines. These verses are further discussed, and there's some additional qualification. New Mishnah, if a Na'ara was betrothed, divorced, and then violated by somebody, there's debate if she's entitled to a fine. The Gemara explains that this is based on the interpretation of various verses on this subject, and the differing opinions are discussed and additionally qualified. New Mishnah, a seducer pays for humiliation, deprecation, and a fine, while a violator also pays for the pain he caused. Further differences, a violator pays the fine immediately, while a seducer pays it when he sends her away. Also, a violator can be forced to marry the woman and take care of her financially for the rest of his life, even if she's extremely undesirable, unlike by a seducer. The exceptions to this marriage by a violator are if she's found to have committed adultery prior, or she's illegitimate, which is based on verses. The Gemara debates which pain exactly it is that the violator is being fined for. The other points and the differences between a violator and a seducer are further qualified. New Mishnah, if an orphan was betrothed and divorced, a person is liable for violating her and exempt for seducing her. The Gemara argues on the source for this ruling. New Mishnah, payment for humiliation is determined based on both parties involved. Deprecation is calculated by assessing how much the woman would have been sold as a slave in theory before and now, based on the difference between the two sums, similar to the whole concept as to when a person pledges their worth to be given to the temple, and the fine is a fixed amount. This notion of fixed fines applies by all monetary liability in Torah. The Gemara debates that the set 50 shekel fine does not include within it the fines for humiliation and deprecation. It also debates who receives these fines based on sources. It's debated if it goes to the woman or to her father. It says there's no biblical source for this, but logically it should go to the father, as he generally got to make decisions for his daughter. It further describes how the deprecation value is calculated. New Mishnah, in some places it was done that a father would sell his daughter as a maidservant to serve for several years, and then would marry her master or his son. There's either permissibility for such a law or punishment for violation or seduction. A minor could be sold by her father as a maidservant, but wouldn't be subject to such a penalty. A na'ara would be subject to the penalty, but can't be sold. A bogeres, an adult woman, can't be sold or entitled to the penalty. The Gemara further qualifies points in these laws. If someone had admitted that they seduced somebody, they pay for humiliation and deprecation, but not for a fine. If somebody admitted that they stole, he pays the principal, but not extra. If somebody admits his ox killed somebody or an animal, he repays the amount, but not if he says it killed a Canaanite slave. Generally, if somebody would have had to pay more than what he damaged, he doesn't pay based off of his own admission. The Gemara says it doesn't mention a case of violation, as that's obvious compared to the seduction case, as there he discredits the woman. Others disagree with many of these points. It cites several sources which imply that half damages are considered compensation, not a penalty. These are further discussed. It's ruled that half damages are actually considered a penalty, and this has relevance by several particular cases. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Kesubos continues discussing the laws of marriage, here particularly in regards to the fines of a violator or seducer. The first Mishnah says, a na'ara, a girl in the middle stage before adulthood that was seduced, the payments for her humiliation, deprecation, and fine all go to her father, as does the payment for pain by a violator. If she sued the man in court before her father died, the payment goes to her father. If the father died before all of this, the payments go to her brothers. If she sued after her father died, it goes to her. If she sued before she became an adult, the payments go to her father, and if he dies, her brothers. If she sued after she became an adult, it goes to her. Some say if she sued while her father was alive, but he died before she could collect the actual payment, the money goes to her. Generally, any of the girl's earnings or fines, if they're uncollected, if the father dies, they go to the brothers. The Gemara explains this is very repetitive of the last Mishnah, but it's to teach that the money goes to her father, and also to teach the dispute between opinions as to where the money goes if she sued the seducer while her father was still alive. It cites a later case that if an accused man denies having seduced or violated somebody and then later admits that it was him, there's a dispute if he pays the fine based on if you hold you can make yourself pay a fine based off of your own admission, although he definitely still would need to pay for the humiliation and deprecation. It said that if he denied having been sued and having to pay the fine, that is considered a denial of monetary obligation, and he'll be liable to bring an oath offering. The logic of this case is further debated. A related point, if a daughter is being supported by her brothers from the estate of their father, there's a question if her earnings go to the brothers in place of the father, or if that's not a valid comparison. And we try to compare it to a related case involving a widow, saying that it should go to the brothers, but this is debated. It's said, based off of a different case, that actually the earnings stay with her, not the brothers, and we bring opinions which corroborate this and sources. This is the final ruling. New Mishnah, if somebody gives his daughter to be married and the groom divorced her prior to the completion of the marriage, and then they restarted the marriage process again, and then he died before they could complete it, both marriage contracts go to the father. If the same case happens, but both times the marriages ended after the final stages of marriage, some say the marriage contracts go to her, some say only for the second marriage. The Gemara says an opinion that she's still allowed to remarry after this, but she wouldn't if she had been widowed 2 times in a row, according to the opinion that such a presumption of reoccurrence is established after 2 occurrences. The logic of the contracts going to the father is that they were written while she's still under her father's jurisdiction. There's debate as to when exactly the base marriage contract of 200 or 100 zuz becomes applicable. Some say it's in the initial stage of marriage, some say it's only after the completion of the entire marriage, and this is debated. The logics are further explained, and it's ruled that all of the contract amounts are collectible after the final stage of marriage. New Mishnah, in regards to a female convert who converted along with her daughter, and the daughter did adultery, the daughter is liable to capital punishment, which back then was strangulation. She's not subject that this occurs at her father's house, and if it turned out that her husband had defamed her, she's not entitled to a fine. If her conception was prior to conversion, but her birth was after, she's instead liable for stoning, and the other 2 points also don't apply. If she's conceived and born after conversion, she's like a Jewish woman in all other respects by these laws. If she has a father but doesn't have a house, or she has her father's house but no father, she's still liable for stoning. The point being that it should be by her father's house, as mentioned in a verse, is just an additional obligation. The Gemara brings sources for these points. It also says regarding the fine for defaming an orphan girl, the verse says you give it to her father. So if she has none, some say it's just not given, assuming the cohabitation happened while she had no father. This is further debated along with if it's required to pay the fine if somebody defamed a minor girl. This is further debated, and there's additional discussion on this point. It also debates based on other sources whether the term for lashes can be used in reference to a monetary loss, and it discusses the punishment for a defamer being lashes, which we bring sources for. It also debates if this still has applicability if the defamed in question and the woman did not ever actually cohabit, which is based on the interpretation of the verses. Uniquely, there's not typically difference drawn by these laws of cohabitation in regards to either the natural or atypical forms of cohabitation. The ruling is usually the same, except by a defamer, where this only applies if the husband is accusing his wife of having done adultery in a natural manner, and also they had cohabited themselves in a natural manner. New Mishnah, a father legally has the right to betroth his daughter, receive the money, accept the betrothal document, or give to be betrothed through cohabitation. He's entitled to her fines and earnings, he can annul her vows, and he can accept her bill of divorce, although he doesn't get to eat the produce of her field. Once his daughter is married, the husband overrides all of the father's rights, although he also gets to eat her produce, although the husband is now also obligated to give his wife sustenance, ransom her if necessary, and pay for her burial. Others say even the poorest man in Israel must hire at least 2 flutes to mourn for his wife at her funeral. The Gemara cites sources for all of these rulings, going through all of the applicable verses. These are for the discussed, going through all the sources for these points, and it additionally discusses the husband's obligations to support his wife. It also discusses the points on the obligation to have flutes by your wife's wedding. Some say that what it's referring to is specifically the opinion which holds that it's an obligation where it's the custom of the man's family to do so. It said we follow this opinion. It's also said if somebody went insane, the court goes through his property and supports his wife and children, and some say also gives adornments for his wife, and some say charity. The logic is debated. If a man is overseas and his wife dies, the court goes through their property to bury the wife according to her status, or at the very least according to his status. This teaches that a woman rises to her husband's status, but does not descend to his status even after her death. Another ruling, if somebody says that if he dies, he shouldn't be buried from his own property, we don't listen to him, as people shouldn't be able to make their families richer off of the public wealth. New Mishnah, a girl is under the domain of her father until she's in her husband's domain in a completed marriage. If the husband gives the daughter to the husband's messengers who will deliver her to him, she's considered in the husband's domain at that point. If the father or his agents went with them, she's still considered to be in her father's domain. She's in the husband's domain once the father's messengers have given her to the husband's messengers. The Gemara says this disputes the opinion that a girl can't eat teruma during her betrothal to a Kohen, and it further debates the legitimacy of using messengers to deliver a daughter to a husband. This is further discussed. There are further points that says that once a woman enters her husband's household, if somebody does adultery with her, they're liable to the capital punishment of strangulation. New Mishnah, a father is not obligated to provide his daughter's sustenance. Based on the wording of the marriage contract, it's implied that the same way sons inherit after their father's death, a daughter is sustained after her father's death. The Gemara clarifies based off this wording that a father is still obligated to provide sustenance for his sons, and he does have a mitzvah to do so also for his daughter, and it debates whose opinion this holds like. This is for the discussed, and some are of the opinion that a father must sustain his minor sons and daughters, although we bring a few sources that the court can't force a person to do this unless he's wealthy. It also debates if somebody wrote off all of his possessions to his children, he and his wife are still sustained from them, and it said we don't rule like this. Generally, it's proper to give 1/10 of all of your income to charity. If you want to give more, it said you shouldn't give more than 1/5, and it brings sources. There are also other points. It also says how and when to discipline a child who won't learn, and some medicinal treatments for a sick child. There are further related points and expansion on a few verses on the importance of charity, and likewise, it further qualifies which property should be given to support children as to whether or not you can use movable property, and this is further debated. New Mishnah, if a groom did not write a marriage contract, if he married a virgin, she gets 200 zuz. If she's a widow, she gets 100 as stipulated by the court. There are particularities by promising land. If he didn't stipulate that he'd ransom her, if necessary, in the marriage contract or similar, he's still obligated to do so as it's stipulated by the court. If such a thing does occur, he's not allowed to divorce her to just get out of it. If his wife gets sick, he's obligated to heal her, but here he's allowed to divorce her to exempt himself. The Gemara debates the author of this Mishnah. This is further discussed, along with if a Kohen's wife was violated, there's debate if she's allowed to remain with her husband after, out of concern that to some degree she'll have reconciled to the attack and the full act won't be legally considered entirely unconsensual. There's debate if this is held, others disagree with this point, and there are related points discussed. It also says that if a woman is held captive by a king, if it's of a major monarchy, the act of cohabitation is deemed non-consensual, and she'd be allowed to be with her husband after. If it was with a minor, irrelevant king, there might be a concern of her trying to marry the king, so she wouldn't be allowed to be with her husband after, and there's a similar point by bandits. This is all further discussed, and there's additional qualification. New Mishnah, if the marriage contract didn't say that the marriage contract would be inherited by their sons, that's still done anyways as a court stipulation. If it didn't say that their daughters will be supported by him until marriage, that's also still done, again, as a court stipulation. If it didn't say that after his death, his estate and house would still support her, that's still done as a court stipulation. The last point was done in Jerusalem and Galilee. In Judea, the heirs could just give the widow her contract payment and be no longer obligated to support her. The Gemara says that it established that part of the marriage contract goes to their children, so that way they'll give large dowries for their daughters, which will help marry them off. A dowry would be a tenth of a person's possessions. And this for the particular discussion on this. There's further qualification and points on what exactly a woman gives up if she waives her right to a marriage contract. Some saying she no longer needs to be given sustenance. There are particular instances of similar things given. There are related points on supporting a daughter, and there are a few other unresolved questions on these laws. A widow is supported by her husband's estate. However, it says not if she remarried, or even if she turned down a marriage offer from somebody if she felt that he was unworthy of her, or if she cohabits illicitly, and some say even if she dresses in a manner to try and attract other men, although it said we disagree with all of this, and it's held that her support ends when she demands the payment of her marriage contract. The remaining points are further qualified, and that's the end of chapter 4.